The gavel is about to fall on 28-year-old Serafina Blackwell. Prosecutor Leland Thorne smirks. He's built another perfect case, painting the black woman as a document forger who tried to defraud a major corporation. Thorne has hidden evidence, intimidated witnesses, and played every dirty trick in the book. He knows the system is on his side. What Thorne doesn't know is that the judge just received a call, and the woman sitting quietly at the defense table isn't just another public defendant. She's the Attorney General's daughter. The air in courtroom 4A of the Manhattan Civil Court was stale, smelling of old coffee and cheap floor wax. It was a smell 28-year-old Serafina Blackwell couldn't get out of her nose. She sat at the defendant's table, her oversized, ill-fitting black suit provided by the public defender's office itching at her neck. She looked small, swallowed by the polished mahogany of a system that was about to digest her whole. Leland Thorne moved with the predatory grace of a shark. He was handsome in a cruel, angular way, with sandy blonde hair swept back and a crisp $3,000 suit. He was the star of the district attorney's office, known for his law and order stance, and a conviction rate that bordered on miraculous. His clients paid premium rates for his particular brand of legal brutality, and today, the state of New York was getting every penny's worth. He flashed a brilliant, toothy smile at the jury, a jury he had carefully selected through voir dire. 9 white faces, 2 Latino, 1 Asian, not a single black face among them. Serafina's court-appointed attorney, Rachel Berg, scribbled frantically on a yellow legal pad. She was young, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, and she was drowning. She knew her client was innocent of the fraud charges, but knowing it and proving it were 2 different universes entirely. The case appeared deceptively straightforward. Meridian Corporation, a real estate development giant, claimed that Serafina had forged a $500,000 consulting contract, creating false documentation to secure payment for services never rendered. They alleged she had used sophisticated document manipulation and false credentials to convince Meridian executives that she represented a legitimate urban planning consultancy. The evidence seemed devastating: forged letterheads, fabricated references, and a paper trail that led directly to Serafina's door. What the prosecution didn't mention was that Serafina had been invited into this web by Delilah Sinclair, a Meridian executive who had discovered illegal bid rigging and wanted to expose the corruption from within. What they didn't mention was that the consulting contract was real, but the services involved investigating Meridian's own criminal activities. And what they absolutely didn't mention was that Delilah Sinclair had died in a suspicious car accident just 3 days before she was scheduled to testify about the true nature of Serafina's work. Thorne stood before the jury like a general addressing his troops. His voice carried the authority of someone who had never known defeat, never questioned his right to destroy lives in pursuit of victory. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey poured over broken glass. "Your Honor, it's almost comedic that Ms. Blackwell here thinks she can waltz into this courtroom with her discount paperwork and challenge a contract validated by 3 certified experts. But I suppose everyone deserves their 15 minutes of delusion." Serafina sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't react to the theatrical condescension, didn't flinch at the barely concealed racism in his tone. Instead, she pulled out a small notebook and began writing. Her handwriting was precise, controlled, the movements of someone accustomed to taking detailed notes under pressure. Rachel Berg glanced at what Serafina was writing and felt her stomach clench. In neat block letters, her client had written, 18 U.S.C. Securer 1341, Mail Fraud Statute of Limitations, federal jurisdiction established through interstate wire transfers. These weren't the notes of a panicked defendant. These were the notes of someone who understood federal criminal law at a level that would make most prosecutors envious. Thorne continued his opening assault, gesturing toward Serafina with theatrical disdain calculated to draw every eye in the room to her modest appearance, her worn briefcase, her obvious lack of resources. The defendant, Ms. Blackwell, would have you believe she is some sort of legitimate business consultant, providing valuable services to major corporations. But the evidence will show that she is nothing more than a sophisticated con artist who created an elaborate fiction to steal $500,000 from Meridian Corporation. He paused for dramatic effect, letting his words hang in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The evidence will show that Miss Blackwell fabricated an entire consulting company, created false credentials, forged references from non-existent clients, and convinced Meridian executives that she could provide urban development expertise worth $500,000. But when it came time to deliver those services, Ms. Blackwell disappeared with the money, leaving behind nothing but lies and forged documents. Serafina looked up from her notebook for the first time since Thorne had begun speaking. Her eyes weren't wide with fear or narrow with anger. They were analytical, studying, measuring. She looked at Thorne the way a forensic accountant might examine a suspicious ledger. Thorne noticed the look and felt a brief flicker of unease. He had expected tears, protests, or at least the wide-eyed panic of someone watching their life crumble. Instead, he was getting the cool professional assessment of someone who seemed to be taking his measure rather than fearing his words. He pushed the feeling aside and moved to the evidence table, picking up a thick manila folder. Ladies and gentlemen, this folder contains the smoking gun, forged contracts, fabricated company documents, false references, and financial records that trace every stolen dollar directly to the defendant's personal accounts. He held the folder up to the light as if the documents themselves were radioactive with criminality. But more importantly, this folder contains evidence of a pattern. This is not Ms. Blackwell's first attempt at corporate fraud. Our investigation has uncovered similar schemes targeting other companies, always following the same methodology. Create false credentials, establish fake references, secure large consulting contracts, and disappear with the money. Thorne thinks he's about to destroy another victim, but something tells me this woman isn't going down without a fight. Smash that like button, because this case is about to explode in ways nobody expected. Rachel Berg stood for her opening statement, her voice betraying none of the confusion she felt about her client's apparent expertise in federal criminal law. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client, Serafina Blackwell, is not the criminal mastermind that Mr. Thorne would have you believe. She is a legitimate consultant who was hired by Meridian Corporation to investigate irregularities in their bidding processes and development projects. Rachel's voice grew stronger as she found her rhythm, though she was working largely blind, forced to construct a defense based on limited information from her mysteriously well-informed client. The prosecution wants you to believe that my client somehow convinced sophisticated corporate executives to pay her $500,000 for non-existent services. But the evidence will show that Ms. Blackwell provided exactly the services she was contracted to provide. A thorough investigation of potentially illegal activities within Meridian Corporation. Thorne made a note on his legal pad, his expression suggesting he had anticipated this defense. Corporate fraud defendants always tried to make themselves look like whistleblowers. The jury would see through it. Delilah Sinclair, a senior executive at Meridian, reached out to my client because she had discovered evidence of bid rigging, contract manipulation, and fraudulent billing practices within her own company. Ms. Sinclair hired my client to document these activities and prepare a comprehensive report for federal authorities. Rachel paused, letting that information settle with the jury. Ms. Sinclair was going to testify that she had personally requested and approved every aspect of my client's work, that every document was authentic, and that every dollar paid to Ms. Blackwell was for legitimate consulting services. Her death in a tragic car accident 3 days before this trial robbed my client of her most important witness. Serafina continued taking notes throughout Rachel's opening statement, but now her notes had shifted to something else entirely. She was writing about wrongful death statutes, federal RICO provisions, and jurisdictional requirements for public corruption cases. Rachel Berg finished her opening statement and sat down, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. Her client's extensive knowledge of federal criminal law was beginning to worry her. Either Serafina Blackwell was far more educated than her file suggested, or she was involved in something much bigger than a simple fraud case. Judge Burke, a stern-faced woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair and the demeanor of someone who had seen every possible variation of courtroom theater, called for a brief recess before the prosecution began presenting evidence. As the courtroom emptied, Thorne gathered his papers with the satisfaction of a predator who had successfully cornered his prey. He had painted Serafina as a sophisticated criminal, implied a pattern of fraudulent behavior, and presented the outline of evidence that seemed overwhelming. The jury would convict, and his perfect record would remain intact. But as he packed his briefcase, Thorne noticed that Serafina hadn't moved from her seat. She was still writing in her notebook, still maintaining that unsettling calm that had briefly unnerved him during his opening statement. He found himself drawn to the defense table, ostensibly to retrieve a pen he had dropped, but really to get a closer look at what she was writing. What he saw made his blood run cold. In neat, precise handwriting, Serafina had written, "Pattern of prosecutorial misconduct. Brady violations confirmed. Potential federal civil rights claims under 42 U.S.C. Section 983. Conspiracy to deprive rights under color of law. 18 U.S.C. Section 241. These weren't the notes of a defendant. These were the notes of someone building a federal case against him. Thorne straightened up quickly, his mind racing. Who was this woman? How did she know about Brady violations and federal conspiracy statutes? And why was she taking notes like a prosecutor instead of a defendant? He caught Serafina's eye as he turned to leave. She looked up from her notebook and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't even a defiant smile. It was the smile of someone who knew something he didn't. Someone who was playing a game with rules he didn't understand. For the first time in his career, Leland Thorne felt a chill of genuine uncertainty. During the recess, Serafina stepped outside the courtroom to make a phone call. She walked to the far end of the corridor, away from the clusters of lawyers and court personnel, and dialed a number from memory. "Control, this is Eagle's Nest," she said quietly into the phone. "Phase 1 proceeding as planned. Target has taken initial bait." The voice on the other end was crisp, professional. "Copy. Eagle's Nest. Any deviations from operational parameters?" "Negative. Subject performing exactly as profiled. Arrogant, thorough in his misconduct, completely confident in his judicial protection. And Judge Burke?" Serafina glanced back toward the courtroom. "Also performing as expected. No indication either target suspects the true nature of the operation." "Understood. Proceed to phase 2. Remember, we need documented evidence of the conspiracy before we can move to arrest." "Roger that. Eagle's Nest out." Serafina ended the call and slipped the phone back into her briefcase. As she turned to head back to the courtroom, she found herself face to face with Marcus Holloway, a prominent civil rights attorney she recognized from the legal community. Marcus was staring at her with a puzzled expression, his head tilted slightly as if trying to solve a particularly complex riddle. "Excuse me," he said hesitantly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but you look incredibly familiar. Have we met before?" Serafina's expression remained neutral, friendly but not encouraging of further conversation. "I don't think so," she replied carefully. "I'd remember meeting you, Mr. Holloway. Your work on police misconduct cases is well known." Marcus's frown deepened. Her voice was what was triggering his memory. Something about the precise diction, the authoritative undertone, the way she pronounced certain legal terms. "I'm sorry, this is going to sound strange, but your voice, I feel like I've heard you speak before, in a professional context. Maybe a conference or legal proceeding?" Serafina glanced at her watch. "I should get back. Court's about to resume." She started to walk away, but Marcus called after her. "Wait, are you absolutely certain we haven't met? Maybe at a federal courthouse? Or a Department of Justice meeting?" Serafina paused, turned back with a polite but dismissive smile. "Mr. Holloway, I think you might be confusing me with someone else. I'm just a small-time consultant who got in over her head." Nothing more. But as she walked back into the courtroom, Marcus stood in the hallway, his memory continuing to churn. He knew that voice. He knew he had heard it before, in a context that suggested this woman was far more than she appeared to be. But where? And when? Back in the courtroom, Judge Burke called the session back to order. Thorne stood to call his first witness, Dr. Margaret Hendricks, a forensic document examiner who specialized in detecting fraudulent paperwork. Dr. Hendricks was a thin, scholarly woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun and wire-rimmed glasses that gave her the appearance of a particularly severe librarian. She had testified in hundreds of cases and had a reputation for thorough, methodical analysis that was virtually impossible to challenge. "Dr. Hendricks," Thorne began, "please tell the court about your examination of the documents in question." Dr. Hendricks opened a thick report and adjusted her glasses with practiced precision. "I was asked to examine multiple documents allegedly created by the defendant's consulting company, Blackwell Urban Solutions. I analyzed letterheads, contracts, reference letters, and financial documents using standard forensic techniques, including paper analysis, ink dating, and digital manipulation detection. And what did your analysis reveal? The documents show clear evidence of systematic fabrication. The letterheads were created using standard desktop publishing software rather than professional printing. The reference letters contain several anachronisms suggesting they were backdated, and the financial documents show signs of digital manipulation." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Thorne smiled with the satisfaction of a chess master who had just announced checkmate. "In your expert opinion, Dr. Hendricks, were these documents genuine business records or sophisticated forgeries?" "They were forgeries, sophisticated ones, but forgeries nonetheless. Someone with considerable skill in document creation had fabricated an entire paper trail to support a fictional consulting business." Thorne picked up one of the evidence bags and held it where the jury could see it clearly. "Dr. Hendricks, in your 30 years of forensic document examination, have you ever seen a more comprehensive attempt to create false business documentation? This case represents one of the most thorough document fabrication schemes I've encountered." The perpetrator clearly understood the types of documentation that corporate executives would expect to see and created convincing replicas of all of them. Throughout Dr. Hendrix's devastating testimony, Serafina continued taking notes with the same analytical calm she had maintained all morning. But now she was writing something different, something that made Rachel Berg's pulse quicken with confusion. Her client was writing what appeared to be a detailed analysis of federal evidence tampering statutes, including specific references to 18 U.S.C. Secretary 15119 and obstruction of justice provisions that most defense attorneys would need to research. Thorne felt a surge of triumph as he concluded Dr. Hendrix's direct examination. This was the testimony that would destroy any credibility Serafina might have had with the jury. Expert forensic evidence was virtually unassailable, especially when delivered by someone of Dr. Hendrix's reputation. Thank you, Dr. Hendrix. No further questions. Rachel Berg stood for cross-examination knowing she was about to fight an uphill battle against seemingly irrefutable scientific evidence. Dr. Hendrix, you testified that the documents in question were created using desktop publishing software. Is it possible for a legitimate small business to use such software for their letterheads and business documents? Certainly. Many small businesses use desktop publishing for cost reasons. And the financial documents you examined, were they created using standard accounting software? Dr. Hendrix consulted her notes. Yes, they appeared to be generated by QuickBooks or a similar program. Is it unusual for a consulting business to use such software? No, it's quite common. Rachel felt a small opening and pressed forward carefully. Dr. Hendrix, when you say the documents showed signs of digital manipulation, can you be more specific? The metadata indicated that certain fields had been modified after initial creation. Is it possible that these modifications were routine business edits rather than fraudulent alterations? Dr. Hendrix paused, clearly uncomfortable with the question. The modifications were consistent with routine editing, yes, but the pattern suggested systematic falsification rather than normal business operations. But you can't definitively distinguish between legitimate business edits and fraudulent manipulation based solely on metadata analysis, can you? Not definitively, no. The determination requires consideration of context and other evidence. Rachel had scored a small victory, but she knew it wasn't enough to overcome the overall impact of the expert testimony. As Dr. Hendrix stepped down, the jury still looked convinced that they were dealing with an elaborate fraud scheme. Thorne called his next witness, Detective Raymond Walsh, the lead investigator who had built the case against Serafina. Detective Walsh was a 20-year veteran of the NYPD Financial Crimes Unit, a thick-set man with graying hair and the confident demeanor of someone who had seen every possible variation of white-collar criminal behavior. He took the stand with the easy confidence of someone who had testified hundreds of times and knew exactly how to present evidence in the most damaging possible light. Detective Walsh, Thorne began, please tell the court how you became involved in this case. We received a complaint from Meridian Corporation about a suspected fraud scheme. They reported that they had paid $500,000 for consulting services that were never delivered and suspected that the entire consulting company was fictional. What did your investigation reveal? Walsh opened his notebook, though Thorne suspected he had memorized every crucial detail. Our investigation confirmed Meridian's suspicions. Blackwell Urban Solutions appeared to exist only on paper. The business address was a mail drop. The phone number went to a generic voicemail service. The references provided by the defendant either didn't exist or claimed never to have worked with her. Did you interview the defendant about these discrepancies? We did. Ms. Blackwell claimed that her business was legitimate and that she had provided valuable consulting services to Meridian Corporation. She said she could prove the value of her work through documentation and witness testimony. Were you able to verify these claims? Walsh's expression hardened slightly. We attempted to interview Ms. Delilah Sinclair, who the defendant claimed could corroborate her story. Unfortunately, Ms. Sinclair died in a car accident before we could speak with her. Did you examine the circumstances of this accident? Rachel Berg started to object, but Thorne cut her off smoothly. Your Honor, I'm not implying anything improper about Ms. Sinclair's death. I simply want to establish that our key witness became unavailable during the investigation. Judge Burke nodded curtly. Continue, but stick to established facts. The accident was thoroughly investigated by the appropriate authorities. Ms. Sinclair lost control of her vehicle on the West Side Highway during rush hour traffic. No evidence of foul play was discovered. So, your key corroborating witness was unavailable. How did you proceed? We obtained warrants to search the defendant's financial records and communication history. What we discovered confirmed our suspicions about the fraudulent nature of her business. What specifically did you discover? The defendant had created multiple shell companies and bank accounts specifically for this scheme. Money flowed from Meridian into these accounts and was then transferred to her personal accounts within days of receipt. There was no evidence of any legitimate business expenses or activities. Throughout Walsh's testimony, Serafina continued her methodical note-taking. But now she was writing something that made Rachel Berg feel like she was drowning in confusion. Her client was documenting what appeared to be a detailed timeline of federal surveillance techniques, noting violations of Fourth Amendment protections and potential federal civil rights violations that suggested she understood law enforcement procedures at an expert level. She just demonstrated legal knowledge that doesn't match her appearance. Thorne's confidence is starting to crack. Hit subscribe because something big is brewing. Thorne felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with presenting devastating evidence. Walsh's testimony was methodical, comprehensive, and utterly damning. The financial records alone would be enough to convict, but combined with the expert forensic evidence, the case was overwhelming. Detective Walsh, in your professional opinion, was this an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern of criminal behavior? Based on our investigation, this appears to be part of a systematic approach to corporate fraud. The defendant had created the infrastructure for multiple similar schemes. Thank you, Detective. No further questions. Rachel Berg stood for cross-examination, knowing this was likely her last opportunity to create meaningful, reasonable doubt. Detective Walsh, you testified that you obtained warrants to search my client's financial records. Can you tell us what probable cause was presented to obtain those warrants? Walsh consulted his notes. The warrants were based on Meridian's complaint and the initial document analysis suggesting fraud. And who provided the documents for this initial analysis? Meridian Corporation provided copies of all relevant contracts and communications. Did you independently verify the authenticity of these documents before using them as the basis for search warrants? Walsh paused, suddenly seeing a potential problem. We relied on Meridian's representations that the documents were accurate copies of their original files. So your entire investigation was based on evidence provided by the alleged victim. That's standard procedure in corporate fraud cases. Detective Walsh, did you investigate whether Meridian Corporation might have had reasons to fabricate evidence against my client? Thorne stood quickly. Objection. Calls for speculation. Judge Burke looked at Rachel with obvious skepticism. Do you have evidence suggesting that Meridian fabricated evidence, counselor? Your Honor, without the ability to independently verify Meridian's claims due to the death of Ms. Sinclair, we're entitled to explore alternative explanations for the evidence. I'll allow limited questioning, but you need to establish a factual foundation quickly. Rachel turned back to Walsh. Detective, did you investigate my client's claim that she was hired by Delilah Sinclair to investigate potential illegal activities within Meridian Corporation? We looked into it, but without Ms. Sinclair available to confirm or deny the claim, we had only the defendant's word. Did you interview other Meridian employees about potential illegal activities within the company? Walsh shifted uncomfortably. We spoke with several of Ms. Sinclair's colleagues. And what did they tell you? They said Ms. Sinclair had seemed troubled in the weeks before her death. She had been asking questions about bidding processes and seemed concerned about certain contracts. So it's possible that Ms. Sinclair had legitimate reasons to hire an outside consultant to investigate potential illegal activities? Possible, yes, but we found no evidence to support that theory. Did you look for such evidence, Detective? Or did you simply assume that Meridian's version of events was accurate? Walsh's jaw tightened. We conducted a thorough investigation based on the available evidence. But that investigation was predicated on the assumption that Meridian was telling the truth and my client was lying, wasn't it? We followed the evidence where it led. Rachel knew she had extracted what little benefit she could from Walsh's testimony, but it wasn't nearly enough to overcome the mountain of evidence Thorne had presented. No further questions. Thorne stood for redirect examination, determined to close any holes Rachel had managed to open. Detective Walsh, regardless of why the defendant might have initially been hired, did your investigation reveal any evidence that she actually provided legitimate consulting services worth $500,000? No. We found no work product, no deliverables, no evidence of any legitimate business activity whatsoever. And the money paid by Meridian? What happened to it? It was transferred to personal accounts and used for personal expenses. Cars, travel, luxury goods, none of it went toward legitimate business purposes. Thank you. No further questions. As Detective Walsh stepped down, Thorne felt the satisfaction of a case perfectly constructed and flawlessly presented. The evidence was overwhelming, the witness testimony was devastating, and the jury looked convinced beyond any reasonable doubt. But as he glanced toward the defense table, he again noticed Serafina's strange calm. She was still taking notes, still maintaining that analytical detachment that had unsettled him from the beginning. Most defendants would be visibly shaken by now, conferring frantically with their attorneys, showing some sign of the stress of watching their lives fall apart. Instead, Seraphina Blackwell looked like someone who was conducting her own investigation. Thorne pushed the troubling thought away and called his final witness of the day, Sterling Morrison, Senior Vice President of Corporate Development for Meridian Corporation. Morrison was Central Casting's idea of a corporate executive. Tall, distinguished, silver-haired, wearing a suit that cost more than most people earned in a month. He carried himself with the unconscious arrogance of someone who had never doubted his place at the top of the economic food chain. "Mr. Morrison," Thorne began, "please tell the court about your role at Meridian Corporation and how you became involved with the defendant." Morrison's voice carried the polished authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I oversee all major development projects for Meridian. When we require specialized consulting services, those contracts come through my office for approval. Can you tell us about your company's relationship with the defendant?" Morrison's expression hardened into a mask of controlled anger. "Ms. Blackwell approached us through intermediaries, claiming to represent an urban planning consultancy with expertise in community engagement and regulatory compliance. She presented impressive credentials and promised to help us navigate complex community relations issues on several major projects. What convinced you to hire her?" Her presentation was sophisticated and professional. She demonstrated detailed knowledge of our projects and seemed to understand the regulatory challenges we were facing. Her references checked out, and her proposed fee structure seemed reasonable for the scope of work she outlined. What was the nature of the work she was supposed to perform? Morrison consulted his notes, though like the other witnesses, he seemed to have memorized the key details. She was contracted to conduct community impact studies, facilitate stakeholder meetings, and develop strategies for managing neighborhood opposition to our development projects. The work was valued at $500,000 over a 6-month period. Did she deliver these services? Morrison's voice took on an edge of barely controlled fury. She delivered nothing. After receiving the initial payment, she became increasingly difficult to reach. When we finally tracked her down, she claimed she had uncovered evidence of illegal activities within our company and was conducting some sort of investigation. How did you respond to these accusations? We demanded that she either produce the deliverables specified in her contract or return our money immediately. When she refused to do either, we contacted law enforcement. Throughout Morrison's testimony, Seraphina continued her note-taking with the same methodical precision she had maintained all day. But now she was writing something in that would have shocked both Thorne and Rachel Berg if they had been able to see it clearly. She was documenting what appeared to be a detailed analysis of federal racketeering statutes, including specific references to predicate acts involving mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy that suggested she understood RICO prosecutions at the level of a federal prosecutor. Thorne concluded Morrison's direct testimony with theatrical flourish. "Mr. Martin, Morrison, in your professional opinion, did the defendant provide any legitimate consulting services to your company?" "None whatsoever. What she provided was a sophisticated con game designed to separate us from $500,000. "Thank you. No further questions." Rachel Berg stood for cross-examination, knowing she needed to land a significant blow to have any hope of creating reasonable doubt. "Mr. Morrison, you testified that the defendant claimed to have uncovered evidence of illegal activities within Meridian Corporation. Did you investigate these claims?" Morrison's pause was barely perceptible, but Seraphina noticed it and made a note. "The claims were baseless. Ms. Blackwell never provided any evidence to support her accusations. But did you conduct an internal investigation to determine whether there was any basis for her concerns?" "We saw no need to investigate unfounded accusations made by someone who was clearly trying to avoid fulfilling her contractual obligations." "Mr. Morrison, you mentioned that Delilah Sinclair served as an intermediary in hiring my client. What was Ms. Sinclair's role in this process?" Morrison's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ms. Sinclair was responsible for coordinating with outside consultants on community relations issues. She recommended Ms. Blackwell's services. So Ms. Sinclair vouched for my client's credentials and recommended that Meridian hire her?" "Ms. Sinclair made the initial recommendation, yes." "And you trusted Ms. Sinclair's professional judgment in making this hiring decision?" "Ms. Sinclair was a valued employee with good judgment. We had no reason to question her recommendation at the time." "Mr. Morrison, is it possible that Ms. Sinclair had legitimate reasons to hire my client? Reasons that your company might not have been fully aware of?" Morrison's jaw tightened visibly. "Ms. Sinclair's tragic death means we'll never know exactly what she was thinking. but the fact remains that no legitimate work was ever delivered. Rachel could sense there was more to explore, but without Sinclair's testimony, she had no way to prove Morrison was being evasive. Mr. Morrison, you testified that my client's proposed fee structure seemed reasonable. $500,000 for 6 months of consulting work. That suggests you believed she was highly qualified, doesn't it? We believed we were hiring a legitimate consultant. We were wrong. But the fee structure itself wasn't suspicious. You regularly pay consultants at that level. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. For the scope of work outlined, the fee was within normal parameters. So if my client had actually delivered the promised services, you would have considered $500,000 a fair price. If she had delivered. But she didn't. Rachel knew she had extracted what little benefit she could from Morrison's testimony, but she had managed to establish that Meridian had considered Serafina's proposed work legitimate and appropriately priced. No further questions. As Morrison stepped down, Thorne felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came with a perfectly executed prosecution. He had presented overwhelming evidence of fraud, devastating expert testimony, and compelling witness accounts that painted Serafina as a sophisticated criminal who had exploited corporate trust for personal gain. More importantly, the jury looked convinced. Several members had taken extensive notes during the testimony, and their expressions suggested they had heard enough to reach a guilty verdict. Judge Burke announced that court would recess until 9 a.m. the following morning, when the prosecution would present their final witnesses before turning the case over to the defense. As the jury filed out, several members glanced back at Serafina with expressions ranging from disgust to pity. In their minds, they had just heard the story of a clever criminal who had almost gotten away with an elaborate fraud scheme. Thorne packed his briefcase with the satisfaction of a job perfectly executed. Tomorrow, he would present financial evidence showing exactly how Serafina had spent Meridian's money, eliminating any remaining doubt about her guilt. The case was essentially over. But as he headed for the exit, he noticed that Marcus Holloway was still in the gallery, still watching Serafina with that same puzzled expression that had been troubling him all day. Holloway was known throughout the legal community as one of the city's most skilled civil rights attorneys. If he was interested in this case, it might mean unwanted complications. Thorne dismissed the concern. Holloway probably just enjoyed observing other attorneys at work, or perhaps he was considering whether to file some kind of civil rights lawsuit related to Meridian's development projects. Either way, it was irrelevant to the criminal case that was all but concluded. As the courtroom emptied, Serafina remained at the defense table, still writing in her notebook with the same methodical precision she had maintained throughout the day. Rachel Berg sat beside her, trying to figure out how to address her growing concerns about her client's mysterious background and expertise. "Serafina," Rachel said quietly, "we need to talk. Your knowledge of federal law is extensive, more extensive than I would expect from someone in your stated profession. I need to know if there's anything about your background that might be relevant to your defense." Serafina looked up from her notebook, her expression carefully neutral. "What specifically are you asking about? Your notes today covered federal conspiracy statutes, evidence tampering laws, civil rights violations, and RICO provisions. These aren't areas where most consultants would have detailed knowledge." Rachel paused, trying to frame her next question carefully. "Serafina, did you go to law school? Do you have legal training that you haven't mentioned?" Serafina was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth to reveal. "I studied law before I moved into consulting work." "You're a lawyer?" "I have a JD, yes." Rachel felt a mix of relief and frustration. A client with legal training could be an asset, but it also raised questions about why this information hadn't been disclosed earlier. "Why didn't you tell me this before? It could significantly affect our defense strategy." "Because my legal education isn't directly relevant to the charges against me." There was something in Serafina's tone, something in the way she phrased her response, that suggested there was far more to the story than a simple career change from law to consulting. "Serafina, I'm your attorney. I need to know everything that might be relevant to your defense. Is there anything else about your background that you haven't told me?" Serafina closed her notebook and looked directly at Rachel. For just a moment, her carefully maintained composure shifted, and Rachel glimpsed something else beneath the surface. Not just intelligence, but authority. The kind of quiet, confident authority that came from real power, real responsibility. "Rachel, I need you to trust me when I tell you that everything you need to know, you'll know when the time is right." It was not the response of a defendant to her attorney. It was the response of someone who was in control of the situation, someone who was playing a game with rules that Rachel didn't understand. Rachel Berg left the courthouse that evening with more questions than answers about the woman she was supposed to defend. Her client was either far more than she appeared to be, or she was completely delusional about her own situation. Either way, Rachel had the growing certainty that she was not being told the complete truth about Serafina Blackwell. As Serafina walked out of the courthouse into the fading daylight of a Manhattan evening, she pulled out her phone and made another call to the same number she had called earlier. "Control, this is Eagle's Nest. Day 1 complete. All targets performing within expected parameters." The voice on the other end was different this time, older, more authoritative, carrying the weight of real power. "Any complications, Agent Blackwell?" "Negative, sir. Subject Thorne is demonstrating the exact pattern of misconduct we anticipated. Subject Morrison is providing expected corporate cover for illegal activities. Judge Burke is showing the judicial bias our intelligence predicted. And your operational security?" "Maintained. Defense counsel suspects I have legal training but nothing more. Surveillance assets report one potential complication." "Explain." "Marcus Holloway is in regular attendance. He may be beginning to recognize me from previous operations or congressional testimony." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "If Holloway becomes a security risk, we'll handle it. Your primary mission remains unchanged. Document the conspiracy, gather actionable evidence, and prepare for operational transition to arrest phase." "Understood, sir. What's the timeline for phase 3? "Maintain current cover until we have sufficient evidence for federal prosecution of both the prosecutorial misconduct and the underlying corporate fraud. The Attorney General wants this case to be unshakable when we make arrests." "Copy that. Eagle's Nest out." Serafina ended the call and disappeared into the crowded Manhattan streets. Just another face in the evening rush hour. But as she walked, her mind was already analyzing the day's events, cataloging the evidence of corruption she had witnessed, and preparing for the moment when she would remove her mask and reveal exactly who she was and why she was really there. Because Leland Thorne was right about one thing. Serafina Blackwell was not who she appeared to be, but he was completely wrong about everything else. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't a fraud artist who had gotten in over her head. She was the daughter of the Attorney General of the United States, operating undercover to investigate the very corruption that was now being used to prosecute her. The system that Thorne believed would protect him was about to become the weapon that would destroy him. The judge he thought was his ally was about to become evidence of judicial corruption, and the woman he thought he was railroading was about to teach him that justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't announce itself with fanfare or warning. It simply appears quietly and inevitably in the place where arrogance once stood unchallenged. The second day of trial began with the kind of crisp Manhattan morning that made even the courthouse steps look almost dignified. But inside courtroom 4A, the air was thick with tension and the accumulated weight of yesterday's devastating testimony. Leland Thorne arrived early, his briefcase packed with financial records that would seal Serafina Blackwell's fate. Today would be the day he destroyed her completely. Serafina sat at the defense table in the same ill-fitting black suit, the same worn briefcase at her feet. But something had changed overnight. Rachel Berg noticed it immediately. Her client's posture was different. Still calm, still analytical, but there was a new quality to her attention, like a predator that had finished studying its prey and was now ready to strike. The morning began with an unexpected development that would set the tone for everything that followed. As court personnel were setting up for the day's proceedings, a young woman approached the defense table with obvious nervousness. "Excuse me," she said quietly to Rachel Berg. "Are you Ms. Blackwell's attorney?" Rachel looked up from her notes. "Yes, I am. Who are you?" "My name is Christina Valdez. I worked with Delilah Sinclair at Meridian Corporation. I think I have information that might be important to your case." Serafina looked up from her notebook, immediately alert. This was an unexpected variable that hadn't been accounted for in the operation planning. "What kind of information?" Rachel asked. Christina glanced nervously around the courtroom, which was beginning to fill with reporters and court personnel. "Ms. Sinclair came to me 2 weeks before she died. She said she had discovered something terrible at Meridian, something that involved falsifying documents and stealing from poor families. She said she had hired a consultant to help her document everything for the authorities." Rachel felt her pulse quicken. Did she mention the consultant's name? She said it was someone she trusted completely, someone who understood how to investigate corporate fraud. She seemed relieved to finally have help. Serafina continued taking notes, but now she was documenting something different, the unexpected emergence of corroborating testimony that could potentially strengthen her cover story while providing additional evidence against Morrison's organization. "Ms. Valdez," Rachel said carefully, "would you be willing to testify about what Ms. Sinclair told you?" Christina nodded, though she was clearly frightened. "Ms. Sinclair was my friend. If someone hurt her because she was trying to do the right thing, I want to help." Thorne, who had overheard part of this conversation from across the courtroom, felt a flicker of concern. Unexpected witnesses were always dangerous, especially ones who might corroborate the defense's claims about Delilah Sinclair's motivations. He approached the defense table with practiced confidence. "Ms. Berg, I couldn't help but notice you're speaking with a potential witness. I assume you'll be providing proper notice if you intend to call additional testimony." Rachel looked up at Thorne with barely concealed dislike. "Mr. Thorne, Ms. Valdez approached us voluntarily with information relevant to our case. We're still determining how to proceed." Thorne's smile was cold and predatory. "Of course. Though I should warn you that last-minute witnesses often create more problems than they solve. Juries don't like surprises, Ms. Berg. They prefer clear, straightforward cases based on solid evidence." He turned to Christina with the kind of intimidating stare he had perfected over years of breaking down witnesses. "Ms. Valdez, isn't it? I hope you understand that testifying in a criminal trial is a serious matter. False testimony carries significant penalties." Christina paled but held her ground. "I understand, but I also understand that telling the truth is important." "The truth?" Thorne repeated, his voice carrying a subtle threat. "Yes, the truth is very important. I trust you'll be very careful to distinguish between what you actually know and what you might have imagined or misremembered." As Thorne walked away, Serafina made a note about witness intimidation that would eventually become part of the federal case against him. But she also felt a growing concern about how Christina Valdez's unexpected appearance might affect the carefully planned operation. Judge Burke called court to order promptly at 9 a.m., and Thorne stood to call his next witness with the confidence of a man who had never lost a case and had no intention of starting now. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Agent Patricia Kellerman of the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. Agent Kellerman was a sharp-featured woman in her early 40s, dressed in a conservative Navy suit that screamed federal law enforcement. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 15 years following money trails and building cases against sophisticated white-collar criminals. But as she took the stand, Serafina noticed something that made her pause in her note-taking. Kellerman's positioning, her awareness of exits, the way she scanned the courtroom, these weren't the behaviors of a typical FBI financial analyst. These were the behaviors of someone with operational experience, someone who understood surveillance and counter-surveillance. "Agent Kellerman," Thorne began, "please tell the court about your role in this investigation. I was brought in to analyze the financial aspects of the alleged fraud scheme. Specifically, I traced the movement of funds from Meridian Corporation through various accounts controlled by the defendant." Kellerman opened a thick folder filled with bank records and financial documents. But Serafina noticed that the agent's eyes briefly met hers during this process, and there was something in that glance, a flicker of recognition or understanding that shouldn't have been there. "What did your analysis reveal?" "The $500,000 paid by Meridian Corporation was transferred through a series of shell companies and accounts, ultimately ending up in personal accounts controlled by Ms. Blackwell. The money was then used for personal expenses including luxury car purchases, high-end travel, and expensive clothing." As Kellerman testified, Serafina began to suspect that this wasn't the straightforward prosecution witness she appeared to be. The agent's analysis was technically accurate, but it was presented in a way that seemed almost designed to highlight the weaknesses in the investigation rather than strengthen the prosecution's case. Thorne moved to the evidence table and picked up a series of photographs showing expensive cars, exotic vacation destinations, and designer goods. "Agent Kellerman, are these purchases consistent with legitimate business expenses for a consulting company?" "Absolutely not. These are classic indicators of fraud proceeds being converted to personal use." But again, Serafina noticed something in Kellerman's delivery, a subtle emphasis on the word classic, that suggested the agent understood these patterns had alternative explanations. As Kellerman testified about money laundering techniques and financial fraud patterns, Serafina continued her methodical note-taking. But now she was writing something that would have stunned everyone in the courtroom if they could have seen it clearly. She was documenting federal surveillance protocols, noting potential violations of financial privacy laws, and outlining what appeared to be a comprehensive analysis of Agent Kellerman's investigation techniques. These weren't the observations of a defendant. They were the professional assessments of someone with extensive experience in federal law enforcement. Speaking of protecting your financial privacy, today's episode is brought to you by Identity Guard. In a world where your personal information can be weaponized against you, Identity Guard keeps your data secure from those who would misuse it. Use code JUSTICE for 30% off your first year of protection. During a brief pause in the testimony, Serafina's phone vibrated with a text message. She glanced at it discreetly and saw a number she didn't recognize. But the message made her blood run cold. Your cover may be compromised. Agent Kellerman is not what she appears to be. Proceed with extreme caution. Control. Serafina deleted the message immediately and continued taking notes, but her mind was now racing through the implications. If Kellerman was an unknown variable, if there were federal agents operating in this case that weren't part of Operation Clean Slate, then the carefully planned operation might be spiraling out of control. Agent Kellerman, Thorne continued, in your professional opinion, was this sophisticated money laundering or simple personal spending? The pattern suggests deliberate attempts to obscure the source and destination of funds. The defendant used techniques commonly employed by experienced financial criminals. But as Kellerman delivered this damning testimony, she made eye contact with Serafina again, and this time the message was unmistakable. The agent was trying to communicate something, some warning or information that couldn't be spoken aloud in open court. Rachel Berg stood for cross-examination, knowing she needed to challenge the FBI agent's conclusions despite having limited ammunition. Agent Kellerman, you testified that you traced money through shell companies. Can you be more specific about these entities? Kellerman consulted her notes. The defendant created several LLCs and business accounts that existed primarily to move money between institutions. Is it unusual for consulting businesses to have multiple business entities? Not necessarily. Many legitimate businesses use multiple entities for liability protection or tax purposes. During this exchange, Serafina noticed that Kellerman was being unusually helpful to the defense, providing answers that undermined the prosecution's narrative rather than supporting it. And the purchases you characterized as luxury spending. Did you determine whether any of these might have been legitimate business expenses? Kellerman paused slightly. We found no evidence of legitimate business purposes for these expenditures. But did you investigate whether such purposes might have existed? We examined the available records and found no supporting documentation. Rachel sensed an opening. Agent Kellerman, if a consultant was conducting undercover investigation work, might they need to maintain certain appearances or access certain venues that could appear to be luxury spending? Thorne stood quickly. Objection. Calls for speculation. Sustained, Judge Burke ruled. Ms. Berg, do you have evidence that your client was conducting undercover work? Your Honor, we're exploring whether the FBI's analysis considered alternative explanations for the financial patterns they observed. You may continue, but establish a factual foundation quickly. Rachel turned back to Kellerman. Agent Kellerman, did your investigation consider the possibility that the defendant's spending patterns might have been related to legitimate investigative work? Kellerman's pause was longer this time, and when she answered, there was something in her tone that suggested she was choosing her words very carefully. We saw no evidence of any investigative activities. However, certain aspects of the financial patterns were unusual for a typical fraud case. This wasn't the answer Thorne had expected from his witness. He stood up, looking confused and slightly angry. Your Honor, I need to clarify something with the witness. Proceed. Agent Kellerman, when you say the patterns were unusual, are you suggesting that the defendant's activities were not consistent with fraud? Kellerman met Thorne's eyes directly. I'm saying that the financial patterns, while suspicious, could potentially have alternative explanations that weren't fully explored during our investigation. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Thorne felt the first real crack in his confidence since the case began. His own expert witness was essentially admitting that the investigation might have been incomplete. But you didn't look for such evidence, did you? Rachel pressed. Kellerman's jaw tightened slightly. We followed standard investigative protocols based on the nature of the complaint. So if legitimate explanations existed for the financial patterns you observed, you might not have discovered them? If such explanations existed and were documented, we would have found them. Rachel knew she had extracted what little benefit she could from this line of questioning, but it wasn't enough to overcome the damaging impact of the FBI's financial analysis. No further questions. Thorne stood for redirect, determined to eliminate any doubt about the financial evidence. Agent Kellerman, in your 15 years investigating financial crimes, how often have you encountered cases where luxury spending on cars, travel, and clothing turned out to be legitimate business expenses? It's extremely rare. Such spending patterns are classic indicators of fraud proceeds being converted to personal use. And in cases where defendants claim to be conducting undercover investigations, how often did those claims prove to be legitimate? Kellerman hesitated for just a moment before answering. I've never encountered a case where such claims were substantiated. But Serafina noticed the hesitation, and she was beginning to understand that Agent Kellerman might be operating under instructions that weren't part of the standard prosecution playbook. Thank you, Agent Kellerman. No further questions. As Agent Kellerman stepped down, Thorne felt the satisfaction of having presented a financial case that was virtually impossible to refute, though he was troubled by some of the agent's unexpected responses. The money trail was clear, the spending patterns were damning, and the FBI's analysis was generally unassailable. But as he glanced toward the defense table, he noticed that Serafina was writing something new in her notebook. She seemed to be documenting potential violations of federal investigation protocols, noting specific statutes that most defense attorneys wouldn't know existed. Who was this woman? The question that had been nagging at Thorne since the beginning of the trial was becoming more urgent with each passing hour. Something about Serafina Blackwell didn't fit the profile of a typical fraud defendant. Her knowledge was too extensive, her composure too professional, her note-taking too sophisticated. Thorne called his next witness, Detective Raymond Walsh, returning to complete his testimony about the investigation. Detective Walsh, Thorne began, yesterday you testified about finding the defendant with stolen Meridian documents. I want to focus now on what happened after her arrest. Walsh opened his notebook. After we arrested Ms. Blackwell and recovered the documents, we attempted to interview her about her activities. How did she respond to questioning? She was unusual. Most defendants in fraud cases either deny everything or try to explain their actions. Ms. Blackwell did neither. She asked for an attorney immediately and then remained completely silent. Is that typical behavior? In my 20 years of investigating financial crimes, I've rarely seen that level of discipline, I guess you'd call it. She acted more like someone with law enforcement training than a typical fraud suspect. This testimony was supposed to demonstrate consciousness of guilt, but Serafina noticed that Walsh seemed troubled by the implications of what he was saying. Detective Walsh, did Ms. Blackwell's behavior during questioning cause you any concerns about the nature of the case? Walsh paused, clearly uncomfortable with the question. I followed standard procedures based on the evidence we had gathered. That's not what I asked. Did her behavior cause you to question whether she might be something other than a typical fraud suspect? Objection, Rachel called out. Calls for speculation. Overruled, Judge Burke said. The detective may answer based on his professional experience. Walsh looked directly at Serafina for a moment before answering. There were aspects of her behavior that were inconsistent with typical criminal defendants. But I was told to proceed with the investigation as planned. Told by whom? My superiors indicated that the case was a priority and that we should focus on the financial evidence rather than psychological profiling. This wasn't going the way Thorne had planned. His witness was essentially admitting that there had been unusual pressure to prosecute this case despite red flags about the defendant's background. Rachel Berg stood for cross-examination with renewed confidence. Detective Walsh, you testified that my client's behavior was unusual and that she acted like someone with law enforcement training. Did you investigate whether she might actually have such training? I was instructed to focus on the financial aspects of the case. But did you personally believe that my client might have legitimate law enforcement credentials? Walsh glanced toward the prosecution table, then back at Rachel. I believed it was possible, yes. Did you share these concerns with the prosecutor? I mentioned them to Mr. Thorne, yes. Rachel turned to look at Thorne with obvious accusation in her eyes. And how did Mr. Thorne respond to your concerns? He told me that the financial evidence was sufficient for prosecution and that speculation about the defendant's background was irrelevant. The courtroom was completely silent as the implications of this testimony sank in. Thorne had known that there were questions about Serafina's background and had chosen to proceed with the prosecution anyway. Detective Walsh, in your professional opinion, should those concerns have been investigated further before bringing charges? Objection, Thorne called out, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Overruled, Judge Burke said, though she looked uncomfortable with the direction the testimony was taking. In my opinion, Walsh said slowly, any case involving unusual defendant behavior should be thoroughly investigated before prosecution. Due diligence protects everyone involved. Thank you, Detective. No further questions. Thorne stood for redirect, trying to salvage his witness's testimony. Detective Walsh, regardless of the defendant's behavior during questioning, the physical evidence of fraud was clear, wasn't it? The financial evidence showed money being transferred from Meridian to accounts controlled by the defendant, yes. And that evidence was sufficient to support the charges? Walsh paused again. The evidence supported the charges as they were filed. Whether additional investigation might have revealed alternative explanations, that's not for me to determine. It was a devastating non-answer that left Thorne looking frustrated and defensive. During the next recess, Christina Valdez approached Rachel Berg again, this time with obvious urgency. Ms. Berg, I need to tell you something else about Delilah. The day before she died, she called me. She said she was scared, that people at Meridian had figured out she was working with an investigator. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. What exactly did she say? She said her phone was being monitored, her computer was being watched, and that she thought someone might try to stop her from testifying. She said the consultant she had hired wasn't just investigating fraud, she was investigating something much bigger. Serafina, who had been listening to this conversation, felt a mix of professional satisfaction and personal sorrow. Delilah Sinclair had died because she had tried to do the right thing, and now her friend was risking her own safety to ensure that the truth came out. Ms. Valdez, Serafina said quietly, you need to be very careful. If what you're saying is true, you could be in danger. Christina looked directly at Serafina for the first time. Ms. Blackwell, I know you're not what you appear to be. Delilah told me she was working with someone special, someone who could actually make a difference. Are you that person? The question hung in the air between them. Serafina couldn't break her cover, but she also couldn't let this woman continue to put herself at risk without understanding the stakes. Ms. Valdez, I need you to trust Ms. Berg to handle your testimony properly, and I need you to be extremely careful about who you talk to and where you go until this case is resolved. Christina nodded, understanding more than was being said explicitly. When court resumed, Thorne called his final witness, Dr. Bradley Thornton, a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in analyzing criminal behavior patterns. Dr. Thornton was a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of academic credentials that impressed juries. He had written extensively about fraud psychology and had testified as an expert witness in dozens of high-profile cases. Dr. Thornton, Thorne began, based on your review of this case, what can you tell us about the defendant's psychological profile? Dr. Thornton adjusted his glasses and opened a thick report. Ms. Blackwell exhibits classic characteristics of what we call a sophisticated sociopathic fraud perpetrator. She demonstrates remarkable emotional control, advanced planning capabilities, and a complete lack of empathy for her victims. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Thorne had saved his most devastating testimony for last. Can you elaborate on these characteristics? The defendant's behavior throughout this trial has been telling. Most innocent defendants would show emotional distress, confusion, or fear when faced with such serious charges. Instead, Ms. Blackwell has maintained an almost clinical detachment, as if she's observing the proceedings rather than participating in them. Dr. Thornton gestured toward the defense table. This type of emotional flatness, combined with the sophisticated nature of the alleged fraud scheme, suggests a personality disorder characterized by manipulation, deception, and complete disregard for the rights of others. Rachel Berg felt sick as she listened to the psychiatric evaluation. The doctor was essentially calling her client a sociopath based on her calm demeanor. The very quality that Rachel had found reassuring was now being used as evidence of mental illness. But Serafina continued taking notes with the same analytical precision she had maintained throughout the trial. Now she was writing what appeared to be a detailed critique of Dr. Thornton's methodology, noting specific violations of psychiatric evaluation standards and potential ethical breaches in diagnosing someone he had never personally examined. Dr. Thornton, Thorne continued, in your opinion, is the defendant likely to reoffend if given the opportunity? Based on the personality profile indicated by her behavior and the sophistication of the alleged crimes, I would consider her a high risk for future criminal activity. Individuals with this type of antisocial personality disorder typically view crime as a rational choice rather than a moral failing. Thorne felt a surge of triumph. He had just convinced the jury that Serafina wasn't just a criminal. She was a dangerous criminal who would continue to victimize innocent people if given the chance. Thank you, Dr. Thornton. No further questions. Rachel stood for cross-examination, knowing she had to attack the foundation of the psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Thornton, did you personally examine my client? No, I based my analysis on observation and review of case materials. Did you conduct any psychological tests or clinical interviews? No, that wasn't necessary for this type of behavioral analysis. So, your entire diagnosis is based on watching my client sit quietly during legal proceedings? Dr. Thornton bristled slightly. I observed her behavior patterns and analyzed them in the context of the alleged criminal conduct. Dr. Thornton, isn't it possible that a calm demeanor during legal proceedings might indicate confidence in one's innocence rather than sociopathic tendencies? It's possible, but unlikely given the other factors in this case. What other factors? The fact that she's taking detailed notes? The fact that she's not crying or showing emotional distress? The combination of behaviors suggests a personality type consistent with sophisticated criminal activity. Rachel pressed harder. Doctor, isn't it true that you've been paid by the prosecution to provide this opinion? I've been compensated for my time, yes. And isn't it true that in every case where you've testified for prosecutors, you've found defendants to have antisocial personality disorders? Dr. Thornton's face flushed slightly. I provide objective analysis regardless of who retains my services. But you've never testified that a prosecutor's target was psychologically normal, have you? I've never been asked to evaluate someone who exhibited normal psychological patterns. Rachel knew she had scored some points against the psychiatric testimony, but the damage was still significant. The jury had heard a respected expert call Serafina a dangerous sociopath. Dr. Thornton, isn't it possible that my client's behavior indicates professional training rather than personality disorder? What kind of professional training? Law enforcement training, military training, federal agent training. Thorne jumped to his feet. Objection! There's no evidence in the record to support such speculation. But Rachel pressed on. Dr. Thornton, if someone were a trained federal agent operating undercover, would their behavior during legal proceedings be different from typical defendants? Dr. Thornton paused, clearly uncomfortable with the question. Theoretically, yes. Someone with operational training might maintain emotional control and analytical detachment as a professional skill. And would such behavior be consistent with what you've observed in my client? It could be, but without evidence of such training. Thank you, Dr. Thornton. No further questions. As Dr. Thornton stepped down, Thorne announced that the prosecution rested its case. He had presented overwhelming evidence of fraud, devastating financial analysis, and expert testimony painting Serafina as a dangerous criminal. The case was perfect. But even as he felt satisfaction at the completion of his presentation, Thorne couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Too many witnesses had expressed doubts about the case. Too many aspects of Serafina's behavior suggested she was more than she appeared to be. Judge Burke called for a lunch recess, and as the courtroom emptied, Marcus Holloway finally approached the defense table. He had been wrestling with his memory all morning, and something Dr. Thornton had said about Serafina's clinical detachment had triggered a crucial recollection. Ms. Berg, he said quietly, I need to speak with you about your client. Rachel looked up, grateful for any potential help. What is it, Mr. Holloway? I know where I've seen her before. Marcus glanced at Serafina, who was still taking notes. 2 years ago, Senate Judiciary Committee hearings on prosecutorial misconduct. She testified as a federal expert witness. Rachel felt her blood run cold. Are you certain? Absolutely. She was introduced as Special Agent Serafina Blackwell, Department of Justice Public Integrity Section. She was the lead investigator on a major corruption case in Chicago. Serafina looked up from her notebook and met Marcus's eyes directly for the first time. Mr. Holloway, she said quietly, I think you might be confused about my identity. But Marcus shook his head. No confusion. I remember your testimony clearly because it led to the conviction of 3 federal judges and a dozen prosecutors. You're not a community consultant, Ms. Blackwell. You're a federal agent. The truth hung in the air between them like a live wire. Rachel Berg stared at her client, understanding finally beginning to dawn. Serafina, Rachel whispered, what the hell is going on? Before Serafina could answer, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and stood up. I need to take this. She walked to the corner of the courtroom and answered quietly. Eagle's Nest. Agent Blackwell, this is Deputy Director Harrison. We've been monitoring the trial. Are you ready for Phase 3? Yes, sir. All targets have demonstrated the expected pattern of misconduct. We have documented evidence of prosecutorial abuse, judicial bias, and corporate conspiracy. Excellent. Your father wants to proceed with arrests immediately. He's en route to the courthouse now. Serafina felt a mix of professional satisfaction and personal anxiety. She hadn't seen her father since going undercover 6 months ago, and their relationship had been strained even then. What's the timeline, sir? Attorney General Blackwell will arrive during afternoon session. We'll execute arrest warrants for Thorne, Burke, and Morrison simultaneously. Federal marshals are already in position. Understood. What about my cover? Blown the moment we make arrests. Marcus Holloway's recognition accelerated our timeline, but we have everything we need for prosecution. Serafina glanced back at Rachel and Marcus, who were watching her intently. Copy that. Eagle's Nest ready for transition to operational phase. Good luck, Agent Blackwell. Your father is proud of what you've accomplished here. The line went dead, and Serafina walked back to the defense table where Rachel Berg was waiting with barely controlled panic in her eyes. Serafina, I need the truth. Right now. Are you a federal agent? Serafina sat down and closed her notebook. The time for deception was over. Yes. Are you investigating this case? I'm investigating the people prosecuting this case. Rachel felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. What does that mean? It means that Leland Thorne has been using his position to railroad innocent defendants for years. It means Judge Burke has been taking bribes from corporate defendants. And it means Meridian Corporation has been using fraudulent contracts and intimidation to steal property from minority communities. Rachel stared at her client, her federal agent client, in complete bewilderment. Why didn't you tell me this? Because I needed you to provide a genuine defense. If you had known who I was, your behavior would have been different. Thorne and Burke would have noticed. Marcus Holloway leaned forward. Ms. Blackwell, if you're conducting a federal investigation, why are you allowing yourself to be prosecuted? Because the prosecution itself is the crime. Thorne has manufactured evidence, Burke is providing judicial cover, and Morrison is using the legal system to eliminate threats to his criminal enterprise. The only way to document their conspiracy was to become their target. Complex legal cases require powerful tools. Today's sponsor, LegalZoom, helps ordinary people navigate extraordinary legal challenges when the system seems stacked against them. Visit LegalZoom.com/justice for a free consultation. Rachel Berg felt like she was living in a spy novel. What happens now? Now, Serafina said, glancing at her watch. My father arrives, and everyone who tried to destroy an innocent woman learns what justice actually looks like. As they waited for court to resume, Christina Valdez approached the defense table one final time. Ms. Blackwell, she said quietly, Delilah told me something else before she died. She said the person she was working with had given her a way to contact them if anything happened to her. Christina pulled out a small piece of paper. She said if she died, I should call this number and tell them that Eagle's Nest needs immediate backup. Serafina looked at the paper and felt her blood run cold. It was an emergency contact number for the Department of Justice. Delilah Sinclair had known exactly who she was working with, and she had prepared for the possibility that she might be killed for it. Ms. Valdez, did you call this number? I called it the day after Delilah died. The person who answered said they were aware of the situation and that justice would be served. They told me to stay safe and trust the process. Serafina realized that Delilah Sinclair's death had been the trigger that accelerated Operation Clean Slate. Her murder, because Serafina was now certain it had been murder, had caused the Justice Department to expedite the timeline for arrests. At exactly 1:30 p.m., as Judge Burke was calling court back to session for the defense to begin its case, the main doors of the courtroom opened with a sharp bang that echoed like a gunshot. The sound made everyone turn, but what they saw made conversation die instantly. Standing in the doorway was a tall, powerfully built black man in an impeccably tailored navy suit who radiated the kind of authority that made federal judges stand up straighter. He was flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals and followed by a team of FBI agents whose presence transformed the atmosphere of the courtroom from judicial proceeding to federal crime scene. Attorney General Robert Blackwell stepped into the courtroom he was about to shut down, and his eyes immediately found his daughter sitting at the defense table. Leland Thorne looked at the imposing figure, then at Serafina, then back at the man whose presence seemed to fill the entire courtroom. A terrible understanding began to dawn in his mind. Blackwell, he whispered. Serafina Blackwell. Robert Blackwell. The Attorney General of the United States began walking down the central aisle, his footsteps echoing in the dead silence. Every eye in the courtroom followed him, but his gaze was fixed on his daughter. Judge Burke found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a croak. Attorney General Blackwell, what brings you to my courtroom? The Attorney General stopped in front of the bench, his eyes never leaving Serafina's face. Judge Burke, I'm here regarding the illegal prosecution of a federal agent. Gasps erupted throughout the gallery. Several jury members looked confused, then shocked, then angry as they realized they had been manipulated. Thorne felt his vision swimming. The confident prosecutor was visibly shaking as the full implications crashed over him like a tsunami. Federal agent? Judge Burke stammered. I don't understand. Attorney General Blackwell finally looked away from his daughter and fixed Judge Burke with a stare that could have frozen hellfire. The defendant in your courtroom, whom you have allowed to be prosecuted on fraudulent charges, is Special Agent Serafina Blackwell of the Department of Justice Public Integrity Section. She has been conducting an undercover investigation of corruption in your jurisdiction for the past 8 months. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Jury members began talking loudly among themselves. Court security moved to restore order, but the Attorney General held up one hand and silence fell immediately. Furthermore, he continued, his voice carrying absolute authority. "This courtroom has been under federal surveillance as part of Operation Clean Slate, an investigation into prosecutorial misconduct and judicial corruption." Serafina stood slowly, her demeanor completely transformed. Gone was the quiet, modest defendant. In her place stood a federal agent who had just completed one of the most successful undercover operations in Department of Justice history. "Your Honor," she said, her voice now carrying the authority she had hidden for months, "I believe there are some things this court needs to know about the case you've been hearing." Thorne tried to speak, but no words came out. His perfect case had just revealed itself to be the trap that would destroy his career and his freedom. Judge Burke looked desperately between the Attorney General and Serafina, understanding finally dawning that her own illegal activities had been documented by federal agents. This is highly irregular." "Judge Burke," Attorney General Blackwell said quietly, "you are under arrest." The words fell like a hammer blow. U.S. Marshals moved toward the bench as Burke sat frozen in shock. "You are charged with conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law, accepting bribes from corporate defendants, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent." As the Miranda warning echoed through the courtroom, Serafina turned to Leland Thorne, who was staring at her with the expression of a man watching his world collapse. "Mr. Thorne Azar," she said, her voice perfectly calm, "I believe you have some explaining to do about your prosecutorial methods." Two FBI agents approached Thorne's table. Agent Patricia Kellerman, who had testified for him that morning, was now placing him under arrest. "Leland Thorne, you are under arrest for conspiracy to deprive civil rights, falsification of evidence, witness tampering, and violations of federal civil rights statutes." Thorne's legs buckled and he collapsed into his chair. The man who had built his career on destroying others was now experiencing the terror and helplessness he had inflicted on dozens of innocent defendants. "This is impossible," he whispered. "This is entrapment. This is justice," Serafina said simply. "Something you stopped believing in a long time ago." As Thorne was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at Serafina one final time. The woman he had thought was his victim was watching him with the same analytical detachment she had shown throughout the trial. But now he understood what he had been looking at. Not the indifference of a criminal, but the professional assessment of a federal agent documenting his crimes. Sterling Morrison, who had been sitting in the gallery waiting to hear the verdict that would validate his corrupt business practices, found himself surrounded by federal agents. "Mr. Morrison," Agent Kellerman announced, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, racketeering, and violations of federal housing rights statutes." Morrison's carefully constructed corporate facade crumbled instantly. The distinguished executive was now just another white-collar criminal being led away in federal custody. "This is harassment," he shouted as the handcuffs clicked shut. "I'm a respected businessman. I know senators. I know governors." "Mr. Morrison," Attorney General Blackwell said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "the only people you're going to know for the next 10 to 15 years are federal prison inmates." As Morrison was led away, Agent Kellerman approached Serafina with an explanation that had been months in the making. "Agent Blackwell, I owe you an explanation. I've been working parallel surveillance on this case for the past 4 months. When we realized you were undercover, I was instructed to provide testimony that would support your operation while gathering additional evidence." Serafina nodded, understanding finally why Kellerman's testimony had seemed designed to help the defense rather than the prosecution. "The financial analysis was accurate," Kellerman continued, "but I emphasized aspects that would highlight the investigation's weaknesses rather than its strengths. Everything I said was truthful, but presented in a way that would support your eventual exposure of the conspiracy. It was a masterful piece of coordination between federal agencies, ensuring that every aspect of the prosecution was documented and could be used as evidence of the conspiracy to deprive Serafina of her civil rights." As the courtroom began to empty of everyone except family members, federal agents, and the core participants in what would become known as one of the most successful anti-corruption operations in Department of Justice history, Christina Valdez approached Attorney General Blackwell. "Sir," she said nervously, "I have information about Delilah Sinclair's death that might be important to your investigation." Blackwell looked at the young woman with the same analytical attention his daughter had inherited. "What information, Ms. Valdez?" "Delilah called me the night before she died. She said she had discovered that someone at Meridian had figured out she was working with a federal agent. She was scared, but she said she had already provided enough evidence to ensure that the truth would come out even if something happened to her." Blackwell's expression darkened. Did she say who at Meridian had discovered her cooperation? She mentioned a name, Vincent Carlucci. He's head of security for Meridian, but Delilah said he was actually Morrison's personal enforcer. She said Carlucci had been asking questions about her computer access and phone records. Within minutes, federal agents were coordinating with NYPD to locate Vincent Carlucci. The investigation into Delilah Sinclair's death was now officially a federal murder investigation, and the charges against Morrison were about to expand dramatically. Rachel Berg sat at the defense table, still trying to process what had just happened. Her client, her federal agent client, was standing with her father, the Attorney General, debriefing the operation that had just destroyed 3 careers and exposed a corruption network that reached deep into the local judicial system. Marcus Holloway approached Serafina with a mixture of admiration and professional curiosity. "Agent Blackwell, that was remarkable work. How long were you planning this operation?" 18 months, Serafina replied. "We identified Thorne's pattern of misconduct early, but we needed to document the full scope of the conspiracy. The only way to do that was to become a target myself." "The risk you took." Serafina glanced at her father, who was coordinating with FBI agents and federal marshals. Their relationship was complicated, but his presence here represented more than just professional support. "The risk was calculated. We knew Thorne's methods, Burke's weaknesses, and Morrison's desperation to avoid federal investigation. They performed exactly as our psychological profiles predicted." Rachel Berg finally found her voice. "Serafina, I feel like I need to apologize. I provided a terrible defense for someone who didn't even need defending." Serafina smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Rachel had seen from her. "Rachel, you provided exactly the defense I needed. If you had known who I was, you would have been too confident, too aggressive. Thorne would have noticed. Your genuine concern and professional dedication made this operation possible. But I was so worried about your calm demeanor. I thought you didn't understand the seriousness of the charges. I understood them perfectly. I also understood that they were fabricated by criminals who were about to be exposed." Attorney General Blackwell approached his daughter, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, his official demeanor softened slightly. "Serafina, excellent work. The evidence you've gathered will put these people away for decades." "Thank you, sir." The operation proceeded exactly as planned. There was still formality between them, the residual distance that had developed during Serafina's undercover assignment. But there was also unmistakable pride in Robert Blackwell's voice. "Your testimony to Congress next week will help us identify similar corruption networks in other jurisdictions. This case is going to have national implications." Serafina nodded professionally, but Rachel Berg could see the complicated emotions beneath her composed exterior. Being the daughter of the Attorney General had clearly been both an advantage and a burden in her career. When corruption runs deep, only complete transparency can restore trust in our institutions. Today's sponsor, Audit Shield, helps honest businesses protect themselves from corrupt practices and fraudulent schemes. Use code INTEGRITY for your comprehensive protection plan. As federal agents finished securing evidence and processing arrests, the true scope of Operation Clean Slate began to emerge. This hadn't been just an investigation into one corrupt prosecutor. It had been a comprehensive examination of systemic corruption that reached throughout the local legal system. Agent Kellerman approached Serafina with a final briefing folder. "Agent Blackwell, preliminary analysis shows connections to at least 12 other cases where Thorne may have manufactured evidence. We've also identified 4 additional judges who may have been taking bribes from Morrison's organization. What's the timeline for additional arrests?" "Federal grand jury convenes next week. We're looking at potentially 30 to 40 indictments based on the evidence your operation generated." The magnitude of what Serafina had uncovered was staggering. Her 6 months of undercover work had exposed a corruption network that had been operating for years, destroying lives and perverting justice on a systematic scale. Marcus Holloway shook his head in amazement. "Agent Blackwell, how many innocent people do you think Thorne convicted using these methods?" "Our preliminary analysis suggests over 200 potentially tainted convictions. The review process will take years, but we expect most of them to be overturned. The human cost of Thorne's corruption was overwhelming. 200 families destroyed, 200 lives ruined, 200 people who had been processed through a system that was supposed to protect them, but instead had been weaponized against them." "What happens to those people now?" Rachel asked. Attorney General Blackwell answered, "We're establishing a federal review board to examine every case Thorne prosecuted in the last 5 years. Innocent people will be exonerated, compensated, and provided with resources to rebuild their lives. And Thorne? Mr. Thorne will spend the rest of his career as a defendant instead of a prosecutor. The irony is not lost on us. As the last of the federal agents finished their work and began filing out of the courtroom, Serafina found herself alone with her father for the first time in 8 months. "Dad," she said quietly, dropping the formal tone she had maintained throughout the operation. "Sarah," he replied, using the childhood nickname he hadn't spoken in years. They stood facing each other in the empty courtroom, surrounded by the debris of the corruption network they had just destroyed. The formal success of the operation was clear, but the personal cost had been significant for both of them. "I know this assignment was hard on you, Mabsa," Robert said, "being cut off from family, from your normal life. It was necessary, the work was important." "It was, but so are you. I never want you to think that the job comes before your welfare." Serafina smiled, and for a moment she looked like the young woman who had decided to follow her father into public service rather than the federal agent who had just completed one of the most dangerous undercover operations in DOJ history. "I learned from the best, Dad. You taught me that justice is worth personal sacrifice. I taught you that justice matters, but I also should have taught you that family matters too." They embraced for the first time since the operation began, and Rachel Berg quietly left the courtroom to give them privacy. She had witnessed something extraordinary, not just the collapse of a corruption network, but the reunion of a family that had been separated by the demands of seeking justice. Outside the courthouse, news crews were setting up for what would become one of the biggest corruption stories of the year: the arrest of a prominent prosecutor, a sitting judge, and a major corporate executive on the same day would dominate headlines for weeks. But inside the empty courtroom, the real story was much simpler. A daughter had risked everything to expose corruption, and her father had supported her even when it meant putting her in danger. They had both understood that some things are worth any risk: justice, integrity, and the belief that the system can be made to work for everyone, not just the powerful. "What happens now?" Serafina asked. "Now," her father said, "you get to go back to being a prosecutor instead of pretending to be a defendant. And I get my daughter back. The trials are going to be complicated. They always are. But we have something Thorne never had." "What's that?" "The truth. And in the end, the truth always wins." As they walked out of the courthouse together, Serafina reflected on the words Thorne had spoken at the beginning of the trial. Everyone deserves their 15 minutes of delusion. He had been right about that, but not in the way he intended. His delusion had been that corruption could be hidden, that power could protect wrongdoing, and that the system would always shield those who abused it. Serafina's 6 months undercover had proven that justice might be slow, but it was inexorable. It might work quietly, without fanfare or warning, but it would eventually find those who perverted it for their own ends. The system that Leland Thorne had thought would protect him had become the weapon that destroyed him. The woman he had thought he was railroading had been the agent of his destruction, and the father whose daughter he had tried to imprison was the man who would ensure he spent the rest of his life behind bars. Justice had been served, not through violence or revenge, but through patience, preparation, and an absolute refusal to accept that corruption was inevitable. Some victories took months to achieve, but they were worth the wait. As Attorney General Robert Blackwell and Special Agent Serafina Blackwell left the courthouse, they carried with them the satisfaction of knowing that the system had worked exactly as it was supposed to, slowly, methodically, and without mercy for those who had betrayed the public trust. But their work was far from over. In the weeks that followed, the true magnitude of Operation Clean Slate would continue to unfold like ripples in a pond, touching lives and reshaping careers across the entire judicial district. Christina Valdez would testify before a federal grand jury about Delilah Sinclair's final days, her testimony leading to additional charges against Sterling Morrison for conspiracy to commit murder. Vincent Carlucci, Morrison's head of security, would be arrested at his Long Island home, where federal agents would discover a cache of surveillance equipment and recorded conversations that revealed the full scope of Meridian Corporation's criminal activities. Rachel Berg would find herself at the center of a media storm as the defense attorney who had unknowingly defended a federal agent. But rather than being embarrassed by her role in the operation, she would emerge as a hero, the dedicated public defender whose genuine commitment to her client had made the entire operation possible. Within 6 months, she would be offered a position with the Department of Justice Public Integrity Section, working alongside the woman she had once thought was just another overwhelmed defendant. Marcus Holloway would become a key witness in the subsequent federal prosecutions, his recognition of Serafina serving as crucial evidence that her identity had been genuine throughout her congressional testimony years earlier. His civil rights practice would expand dramatically as dozens of Thorne's former victims sought representation in wrongful conviction lawsuits. The 200 potentially innocent defendants whose cases would be reviewed represented more than just legal statistics. They were fathers who had missed their children's graduations while serving time for crimes they hadn't committed. They were mothers who had lost custody battles because of fraudulent criminal records. They were young people whose lives had been derailed before they truly began, all because one man had decided that winning was more important than truth. Among them was Marcus Thompson, a 24-year-old teacher who had been convicted of drug possession based on planted evidence. He had spent 3 years in prison, losing his job, his apartment, and his fiancée. When federal investigators reviewed his case, they discovered that Detective Walsh had planted the drugs during an illegal search, and that Thorne had knowingly presented false testimony about the chain of custody. There was Elena Rodriguez, a single mother who had been convicted of welfare fraud based on documentation that Thorne had altered to inflate the amount of assistance she had allegedly stolen. She had served 18 months in prison while her children lived with relatives, watching their mother's reputation destroyed in their community. And there was David Chen, a college student who had been convicted of assault based on testimony from a witness whom Thorne had coached and paid. David had lost his scholarship, been expelled from school, and spent 2 years working minimum wage jobs while trying to rebuild his life. Each of these cases would require careful review, extensive investigation, and ultimately formal exoneration. The Federal Review Board that Attorney General Blackwell established would work for years to undo the damage that Thorne had inflicted, providing not just legal vindication but financial compensation and resources for rebuilding shattered lives. The psychological impact on the victims was immeasurable. Many had lost faith not just in the legal system but in the fundamental American promise that justice was blind and truth would ultimately prevail. The revelation that their prosecutions had been part of a systematic corruption network was both validating and traumatizing. Validating because it proved they had been right to maintain their innocence, but traumatizing because it revealed how completely they had been betrayed by the system they had been taught to trust. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the legal community itself. Prosecutors across the country began reviewing their own practices, understanding that the pressure to maintain conviction rates could lead to the same ethical compromises that had destroyed Thorne's career. Defense attorneys found themselves with new tools and precedents for challenging prosecutorial misconduct. And judges were reminded that their role as neutral arbiters was essential to maintaining public faith in the judicial system. The trials of Thorne, Burke, and Morrison would become landmark cases in the study of institutional corruption. Law schools would teach courses on Operation Clean Slate, analyzing how systematic abuse of power could be exposed and prosecuted. The case would be cited in congressional hearings on judicial reform and referenced in Supreme Court decisions about prosecutorial immunity. Serafina herself would become something of a legend within the Department of Justice, though she would always prefer to work behind the scenes rather than seek public recognition. Her willingness to put herself at risk for the sake of justice would inspire a new generation of federal agents and prosecutors who understood that sometimes the only way to defeat corruption was to become its target. The friendship that developed between Serafina and Rachel Berg would endure long after the trials ended. They had shared an experience that few people could understand: the strange intimacy of working together while one of them maintained a completely false identity. Rachel's genuine care for her client had touched Serafina deeply, reminding her that even in a system corrupted by ambition and greed, there were still people who believed in justice for its own sake. Years later, when Serafina would look back on Operation Clean Slate, she would remember not just the successful arrests or the convictions that followed, but the moment when her father had walked into that courtroom and she had seen pride in his eyes. She would remember the relief on the faces of the innocent people whose convictions were overturned. And she would remember the lesson that her father had taught her long before she became a federal agent: that justice doesn't belong to those with the loudest voices or the most expensive suits, but to anyone brave enough to stand up and demand that the system work the way it was designed to work. Leland Thorne's perfect record was finally broken. But unlike all his previous victories, this defeat served justice rather than destroying it. And in the end, that made all the difference. The courthouse steps had seen many defendants walk down them in handcuffs, but rarely had they witnessed the arrest of the very officials who were supposed to uphold the law. Today, justice had come full circle, and the system had proven that no one, no matter how powerful or protected, was above accountability. The last word belonged not to the corrupt prosecutor who had built his career on destroying others, but to the federal agent who had risked everything to expose the truth. Justice doesn't need a loud voice or expensive suits or political connections. It just needs someone brave enough to speak it, patient enough to document it, and powerful enough to enforce it. In the end, Serafina Blackwell had given Leland Thorne exactly what he had always claimed to seek: a perfect case built on unshakable evidence. The only difference was that this time, he was the defendant, and justice was finally on the right side. The truth doesn't need expensive suits or loud voices. It just needs patience, preparation, and the courage to strike when the moment is right. Like this video if you believe no one is above the law. Subscribe for more stories where justice finds those who think they're untouchable. And comment below. What should happen to prosecutors who abuse their power to destroy innocent lives? Remember, corruption may hide for years, but justice is patient, and when it finally arrives, it's absolute.